Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the Watershed Protection Department's City of Creek Learning Series. I'm Jessica Wilson, Interim Division Manager of Environmental Monitoring and Compliance, and today we have our longtime friend and colleague, Matt Hollon, here to talk about the history of Austin's watershed protection ordinances. Austin was an early adopter of watershed ordinances starting in the early 1970s and steadily evolving over the next 4 decades in response to specific local challenges and improvements in the science of watershed protection. This talk's particularly timely as our department's actively working on our community engagement to update our strategic plan as we face challenges like climate change, population growth, and racial inequities. Matt's talk will explore the major milestones along our planning journey and the role that additional regulatory protections might play in the future. So take it away, Matt.
Hey, good morning, everybody. It's really great to be here and share this with you guys. And I'm really looking forward to the conversation at the end, especially. This has been something I've been working on most of my career. I first joined the city of Austin in 1990 when we were kind of the dawn of some of this work that I'm going to be showing, not the dawn, but early stages. So I'll be talking about the history of Austin's watershed protection ordinances. I was telling Jessica, I've had the chance to really look through a lot of your earlier work on this City of Creeks series, and I'm really impressed with it. I struggle with how to actually present this because it's so much information, and I'm worried that it's going to be a little bit didactic. But what I would like to do is try to tie together some of the stuff that you guys have been talking about and then have a look forward. So really appreciate the time. Okay, so this is a kind of boring slide, but it sums up the whole talk. And I actually do want to go through some of these just to kind of show what I'm going to talk about later. So I'm going to start out by just listing, I actually have cataloged the ordinances going back into, the dawn of time from Austin. And there's something like 140 or 150 watershed related ordinances that touch on. And so obviously I'm not going to talk about 140 or 50 things. I'm going to talk about 10 or 11 things. And so I'll give you the Hall of Fame short list of ordinances mercifully, so you don't have to wade through the whole thing, and really just looking at the highlights. I'm going to be focusing on environmental and flood protections from development, and that's the Land Development Code oriented ordinances. There are other really important regulations that are the watershed focuses on, such as the spills group, and there's parts of the code that are super important. I'm not going to be focusing as much on those. Those could be a separate talk. I'm going to be looking at the ones that talk about land development. And then I don't really pound on this that hard, but basically the regulations are just the first thing you want to look at when you're trying to protect watersheds, because the famous phrase, an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure, absolutely resonates with this. If you can get ahead of damage to watersheds by shaping development as it goes in such that it's much more responsive and done really well, you can really avoid a lot of problems that are basically either very difficult and costly to correct, or maybe even can't even be corrected at all. And then I'm going to go through some geographic, demographic, and political influences that kind of set the stage for how these things unfolded over time. And then I'll just briefly say, because this is a broad audience, and I want to make sure that everybody is comfortable with what is an ordinance, what's the difference in an ordinance and code, and what's a rule, how does criteria work. I won't go into that in great detail, but I just wanted to touch on that as I go through this. And then I'll show a few examples from the past that kind of tipped the balance to demanding action. And that would be, Austin has grown very rapidly for a very long time, and it doesn't seem like there's a slowdown in sight. That was what really drove the early ordinances to come into being and continue to this day. And then I will talk about how Austin has a very unique local community that is very well educated and very excited and very interested in getting this done, this kind of work done. Unlike many of the other communities around the country, we had a lot of local backing very, very early. Austin was an early adopter of these kinds of ordinances and served as a national leader, frankly. Nice Star Wars reference here. The state wasn't particularly interested or supportive of what we were doing, especially during the early 90s. And so there was some backlash there that I'll talk about a little bit. And I think that's something important to think about going forward, because, they're an important actor in all this, and they play a key role. And then as we had the public really involved in the beginnings of this and saying, we've got to do something, a lot of the expertise was in the public initially. A lot of the citizens were very well educated and educated themselves and really pushed this forward. And now I would have to say that the Watershed Protection Department has gone from basically non-existent to really becoming into our own as this process went along. And now we are one of the larger departments in the city, and we have a really big role in keeping this going and consolidating the gains and making sure that it moves forward. Finally, again, Austin continues to grow. And so things are changing still. And the land cover and the nature of what we have is really changing. And so what do we need to have change with it? And so that's the question that Jessica mentioned is what are we looking at moving forward? And then we have this really very difficult, unprecedented situation of global warming / climate change. And we're adjusting to that. And we know that Mother Nature is going to play the last cards, or at last, as it were, in a baseball analogy. And so how do we prepare for that? What are the things? And I think that's a big part of what needs to change. And then we'll have a conversation about where we go next. So sorry about the text-heavy slide. Many of these are text-heavy. I'll hopefully keep it lively verbally. This is just a really quick summary of the City of Creeks Learning Series episodes that you guys have talked about so far. You talked about some challenges. There were 2 stream functional pyramid episodes, fantastic work. One on the urban stream syndrome, ecological thresholds, and so forth, salamanders, and the Blackland Prairie. Actually, all of these are things that our ordinances touch on at one level or another. I'm not saying that they nail it or get it all right, but the fact that the Austin community was struggling with these same issues, and even as the community and later, and especially staff, were wrestling with this and getting the expertise to understand these things, the ordinances were set up to try to prevent the urban stream syndrome from getting as severe as it could be, and actually hitting on a number of the stream functional pyramid elements and so forth. And then you've got these various solutions, and some of these are just directly right out of our ordinance. The stormwater control measures are part of the code. That was a new idea from the early 80s, and that has continued to this day. The MS4 and TMDL were both federal regulatory efforts. The state interacts with too. Those are have similar roles. I'm going to go quickly. Everybody's got to have a stream functional pyramid slide in, and I needed to have it in here too. So again, I'm going to hit on a lot of these things in the talk. You guys can refer to those 2 excellent, much more detailed conversations if you want to get more details. But a lot of the ordinances are trying to hit at different pieces of this. And we didn't understand, as the history unfolded, we really didn't understand all of this at once, of course. This took some time and a lot of hard work and energy to understand well. And we're still in the process of really understanding it. But this is the driver. All right, so here's the Hall of Fame list. I'm focusing on 7 key ordinances, with the 8th still to come. And the first one was the 1974 Waterway Ordinance. And so I'll show pictures and so forth of some of these in a little bit. But basically, you've got the early waterway ordinance. You've got the 1980 watersheds, the dawn of time. This was our first main flood ordinance, and it addresses natural creeks, which is a big deal. In a sec, my next slide is going to just go through each one of these and show the main points. Remember the names. I know this is a lot of information. In the early, and I actually cringed as I was trying to figure out even a date for this. The proto versions of this are in the 1979, maybe even 1978 era, but by 1980, formal ordinances were set up for these. I think there was something like 14 or 15 Lake Austin ordinances if you add them all up. So none of this happened in one shot. This was Austin experimenting and sort of developing this little by little. But you've got Lake Austin, you got multiple Barton Creek ordinances, you got multiple Williamson Creek ordinances, and a few other ones like them. But they form the beginnings of the water quality protection. Piggybacking onto the 1974 Waterway Ordinance is the 1983 Floodplain Ordinance. And so it brings in the 100-year floodplain. I think they just call it the Floodplain Ordinance. That's a really big one, and I'll talk about some of the unique characteristics of that. 1986 was where the city of Austin said, wait a minute, we've been protecting these western creeks, Lake Austin, Barton, and Williamson, to this really high level, and that's important. In fact, it started there because Lake Austin was first, and it makes a lot of sense. We wanted to protect our water supply. Let's not foul our nest. Let's make sure that long-term we have very high-quality water for our drinking water and for our community use. And then Barton and Williamson were early Barton Spring Zone watersheds that people understood were very directly affecting Barton Springs. So by 1986, we were realizing, well, let's bring in the whole community. Sort of at the last minute, I understand, there was a compromise, and the urban watersheds were carved out of the 1986 watershed ordinance, so it actually didn't include those. So there's a bit of an asterisk, because 5 years later, in 1991, urban watershed ordinance was passed that filled that in. But the CWO, as it's called, was a big ordinance. very big. And that was just 4 years before I started. So that was kind of the talk of the town when I first came in. And then in 1992, it's going to be its own episode of this series to talk about the Save Our Springs Ordinance, the SOS Ordinance. But this was a very big deal and had to do with one of our most sensitive watersheds, and the fact that the community was looking at what was happening and perceiving that existing regulations, for instance, the CWO, were not going to be enough to protect that particular very, very sensitive system. And so there was actually a community referendum to vote on that ordinance, and it passed overwhelmingly by a 2-to-1 vote, which is a pretty overwhelming mandate. And then in 2013, a lot of us in the room here helped create this watershed protection ordinance, which was basically an effort to bring in some protections that were very needed, that basically were sort of left out of the 1986 Comprehensive Watershed Ordinance. And I'll talk a little bit more about that. Even more recently, I had the pleasure of working with Kevin Shunk and a bunch of other hardworking folks on the 2019 Atlas 14 floodplains ordinance. And it was really important to bring Austin up to speed with a new understanding of flood risk. And then now, Andrew Bates and Aaron Wood, Kelly Strickler, Nick Kincaid, and I, and others worked super hard on this Code Next and this land development code revision process in the late 2015-16 range, and kind of went on for 3, 4, 5 years, and then sort of went away after a court order. We now have from council a new resolution that's talking about doing some new work on that and actually pulling some of the elements that were proposed in Code Next and the land development code revision. So I want to talk a little bit about that. And generally, the conversation is what are the elements that are missing from all of this good work from the past? So I did want to mention a few others. There's a landscape ordinance, which was really crucial, that completely transformed the way we have parking lots in town. There's a 1983 tree ordinance, which is incredibly important in protecting our city's tree canopy and individual trees. There's also a follow-up heritage tree ordinance that I didn't mention on here. It's one of the 150 ordinances. Urban watershed ordinance, of course, filling in the gap. And then Aaron Wood dug out this incredible ordinance from 1911. I won't belabor it too much. I'm semi-facetiously calling it the maximum flood ordinance. That's part of the language in here. So I've set this up so that people can go back and look at these slides later and study them. This is just a cataloging of the different things that happen, the major points. And many of these ordinances had dozens of elements to them, so that they're way too detailed to talk about it in just one talk. But you basically have the things that I mentioned earlier about in these different milestones. And so here we have yet more things going on. So when you think about our protections, they didn't happen overnight. They happened over a very long period of time. They were honed and perfected over time, and that continues to go on. And one of the things I wanted to really emphasize is that watershed protection is a relatively young practice of young science. Obviously, humans have known about impacts of floods and rainfall and drought and all these things for a long time, and have responded very intelligently over time for a long time. But really, the kind of work we're doing really started in the 70s in a lot of ways. And it's important to recognize those beginnings. All right, so here's our natural setting. A lot of people, when they think of Austin, think of the Edwards Plateau kind of geography. And so here's Barton Creek and this incredibly beautiful spot. And so a lot of people are thinking, well, and so this was a natural place to start in Austin is, wow, our water supply is directly affected by our Edwards Plateau. And it's something that's near and dear to the hearts of so many people in our big and growing city. But there's also another part of Austin, which is the Blackland Prairie, which is super important. This is an old photograph Aaron Wood and I used back in the old days for the 2013 Watershed Protection Ordinance, but it shows Gilliland Creek coming through here where SH 130 was coming in. You can see SH 130 is actually in construction in this photo. But this is a very different geography, and it was in some ways ignored in the first ordinances and needed to be addressed in later ones. And I think that there's probably still work to do there. This is a wonderful sequence that Aaron set up some time back, just kind of showing the different geographic elements that make up our watershed geography. And so you have these things like Lake Travis, and Barton Springs, and McKinney Falls, and the river, of course, moving through the whole thing. You got the Balcones fault line splits the hill country from the Blackland Prairie. So you have big floodplains on the east. And so later on, we're going to be having watershed ordinances that help address, I think the Atlas 14 ordinance really bumped that up a notch. Our water supply ordinances were the early developer of a really driver. We've got to protect our lake, like I mentioned earlier, and we've got to protect Barton Springs. And so our segments for the Edwards Aquifer were a big focus of this work early on. And then the creeks came into the fore with the 1986 CWO citywide, except for the urban. The gap was filled in 1991. Some of the drivers are very familiar to all of us that are considering all these things. Austin has skyrocketed in population. We keep doubling every, I don't know, something like every 22 years, the population of Austin doubles. Sorry about crowding this little graphic here. It makes it look pretty extreme, but it is going up very rapidly. We're one of the most rapidly growing communities in the country. In order to have a place to live and go to work and places to recreate, land development occurs to keep pace with that. And that's the thing that's transforming land cover. Our citizens are incredibly involved and really drove the early ordinances. This was not something that came down from the federal government that the state imposed on us, for sure. It was something that our community wanted and insisted on. The state's also super involved in this. They're a big factor. They're very aware of what we're doing and just kind of swoop in periodically to make changes in what we do. This is one of my favorite slides. We pretty much have to use it every time we have a talk. We're in a unique geography that has extremely extreme flash floods, and that has driven our flood ordinance setup. And it doesn't take a genius to understand what a flash flood alley looks like. If you look at some of the old photos, here's basically Congress Avenue Bridge looking across the river during the 1935 flood. Here's another picture during that flood. I need to verify this shot. This is a pretty famous photo. These lakes that were built were able to, especially Lake Travis, was basically a gigantic flood detention pond / water supply lake. So the flooding on the Colorado River has really been largely tamed by that in terms of the overwhelming ones that you saw a second ago from Congress Avenue Bridge. But we still do get flooding from storms that hit directly on Austin, on the Colorado even. And then you get Llano River flood and so forth. Our modern regulations were really shaped by the Memorial Day flood, where you had 13 people die. This was one of the worst, certainly modern catastrophes from flooding. And this really informed and so the 1983 flood ordinance follows directly after that. And then you've got Barton Creek Square Mall was another driver. I was a little under the impression that this was one of the early drivers. Honestly, this was kind of in the middle of it on next reflection. That was the early, there was a big hill that was completely vegetated and then basically flattened and turned into this sort of pancake flat mall surface where they built it. And this is what it looks like today. And it's only a couple of miles upstream of Barton Springs. And when it was under construction, there were all kinds of sedimentation problems and so forth. So we didn't have early erosion and sedimentation controls at the time in any kind of sophisticated way. And so that really drove a lot of public outrage and helped create these. I'm going to recommend this interesting show, and there was a hot link in there to go watch it. It was, I believe it was supported by Watershed Protection Department. It's a show that talks really about prior to this too, but the 60s and early 70s leading up to that first 1974 ordinance and a little beyond. But it's quite well done and shows that, hey, the 1980 or 79 Barton Creek Mall was not the first rodeo for Austin. And then even as the Comprehensive Watershed Ordinance of 1986 helped the creeks, especially in the west, the headwaters creeks. When we say headwaters creek, obviously the creeks don't just magically stop at a certain point, but our regulations identify creeks that are 64 acres in drainage or greater as a regulated creek. In the east, we didn't do 64-acre creeks. We did 320-acre creeks, or half a square mile for a really long time. And so you were getting a lot of this, even in a creek that should have been protected, that would have been in much more natural condition, just kept getting developed over and over again and really transformed. And then finally, the last slide for this, we had a 2013 Onion Creek flood. I could have slides for the 2015 Onion Creek flood and the 2015 Memorial Day flood ×2, the second version. And then there was even a 2016 flood, another flood again. So you ended up with a lot of damage. And then finally, this is one that's kind of still hanging out there. So with these different watershed ordinances, this is the recharge zone here for the Barton Springs zone. And so Barton Creek is this kind of lighter mid-blue color here. And so you've got this really kind of complicated ordinance system that's geared toward here. This is protecting Barton Springs. This is protecting Lake Austin and our water supply. Here's Lake Travis. And so let's have low impervious covers. These percentages talk about impervious cover. And so you're trying to keep these low. And so basically, we were really worried. The state of Texas was going to come in and say, you can't do this. You cannot protect these watersheds at this high level. We're going to override this. Austin sort of desperately said, look, please don't do that. And we fought off an important lawsuit and won a lawsuit with the Texas Supreme Court to keep the SOS ordinance in place. But a lot of what we were doing is saying, hey, don't worry. You can go out here into the eastern watersheds and develop this to your heart's content. We're going to let that level of intensity, go a lot higher. So don't, not to worry. Austin's a development-friendly place. we're good, go over there. And it's led to some strife now. I think there's a lot of folks on the eastern side are saying, well, hey, how come you have all these incredibly strict protections on the west in what you call the drinking water protection zone and not in what you've labeled the desired development zone over here in the east? These differences still exist. And there's a much longer conversation about that we could have that talks about what, the implications of that. So what is the Land Development Code? The code is the codification of ordinances, which are local laws. And so the city council is the only group that can actually approve these ordinances. If they consider them, and if they do approve them and sign them, they go into the Land Development Code. So there's this big, thick, if you got paper copies, big, thick, or the giant digital version. And so council or the planning commission can get them booted off and initiate them. And then the staff then processes all of the different options and brings up a recommendation for council's consideration. And so right now, if we do have a Land Development Code change, it maybe would renumber everything, but the drainage and environment chapters are the ones that are most key. And basically, I like to kiddingly say that code is where the council says, thou shalt bake a cake. You're going to have to do this. If you develop land, you're going to have to bake a cake. And then there are some code associated criteria, like technical criteria. They start out being called rules. And I don't know why there's all these multiple names for everything, but this is a staff-driven process. And it says, here's how you comply with the code. And so if the council says, thou shalt bake a cake, the staff then says, okay, well, here are some cake recipes. And if you bake them correctly, you're going to get approval for your project. You're going to be in compliance. So that's my sort of facetious way of remembering that. This is for later use. I listed all of the major watershed protection regulations on these slides. Here's the second one. And then I wanted to show you briefly a couple of slides that show the milestones in Austin's watershed history. And so I am not going to go through every one of these, even though they're awesome. This shows the same ordinances that I mentioned earlier. Basically, you have community interactions each time that drive these. And so we had rapid Barton Springs zone development in Barton Creek, especially in Williamson, that led to the 1974 ordinance. And then you've got that continued until 1980. And then we got the Barton Creek Williamson. That's when you started driving the water quality ordinances. Then you have the major Memorial Day flood, and that drives a whole bunch of things. The floodplain ordinance, also the CIP funding source with basically the first drainage fee. And then you've got, of course, the Barton Springs zone development just kept on going, and people were extremely anxious about it. And that's when the SOS non-degradation water quality standard was passed. Then you have major floods in 2013, the Halloween flood number 1, Halloween flood number 2, plus Memorial Day flood number 2 in 2015, and then even throw in another 2016 flood. And that helped spur a lot of council interest in the Atlas 14 ordinance. I think that was staff brought forward the fact that we had this new federal study that showed the flood risk had really changed and elevated, but there was an incredible receptivity by the council at that point. And then you have this incredible drought during the 2008 to 2015 that's starting to shape things. And I think that's driving some of the discussion about green stormwater infrastructure and some of the other things and also rainwater harvesting and some other important work we do. And I wanted to just briefly talk about, so the main question at the end of this is there something missing here? And a lot of times I look at this and think, gosh, some of the biggest stuff that needed to get done has been done. Pre-1970s, we didn't have floodplains at all. There was no regulation for that. There was no regulation for water quality. There was no regulation for a lot of things. So putting in floodplains, putting in stream buffers, putting in water quality controls, putting in impervious cover limits, those are by far the biggest, in my mind, ordinances that have been passed in terms of like just getting the heavy lifting done. But then there's a whole bunch of other fine tuning that need to be done because that's not enough to just do those 3 or 4 big things. There is still unfinished work. I know that Councilmember Chovo has recently passed a resolution calling on looking at some additional revisions. And so that's something that for our conversation. Austin just continues to grow. We have simultaneously, we're still sprawling and densifying. That's creating a real estate dynamic that's unprecedented in terms of costs and displacing folks. There's all kinds of really deep equity concerns and ongoing environmental impacts. So a lot of ways that things haven't changed in terms of the backdrop. But one thing that has changed, though, is the community attention. And so when you look back at the 70s and 80s and early 90s, there was so much attention on these watershed issues, and it was really front and center in the community. It was one of the most talked about items. And I remember it very directly from being a young person at that point. That's really changed. And I think that's an important thing for us as staff to acknowledge and recognize. I mean, there's so many other things with transportation, with affordability, with equity that are going on that we're not as front and center as we used to be. And that's a factor. And so we're playing with all these other, the system we're in, we're needing to really become part of a larger conversation. And then the state is still in the picture. They have the ability to strike down a lot of the work we do and have done so. And so there's a lot of concerns about that, and acknowledging their role and understanding their work is really an important part of what we do as we propose our own new rules. And then with climate change, global warming, a lot of the things we thought were working or that we needed to protect that's changing. So that's going to be just an important thing to understand. And then finally, this is the main conversation: is what we're doing working? Is it sustainable? And is it equitable? And when I'm talking about sustainable, I mean, are we addressing the environmental problems in the way we should? And then finally, a big shout out to my colleagues and beloved colleagues at Watershed working on the Rain to River plan. I think that's really going to take on a new importance with this. What are we missing? What are the things that people are really concerned about that are gaps, and how do we address those?
But thank you for taking us on the journey today, Matt. I remember when I started working with the city in 2011, and even though I'd been involved from the community side and stuff like Imagine Austin, I really, in 2011, back when we had cubicle walls, I remember you walking by and asking my boss, can Jessica be on the Watershed Protection Ordinance team? And then, getting that deeper understanding of the 2 years of work that it takes to get to the point where something is passed is really impressive how this work is ongoing.
That was, and it even had, I mean, all of these things build on each other. And so the Watershed Protection Ordinance, I mean, it started with the Environmental Board in 2010. They had deep conversations with us about that as staff, and then it took until 2013. So basically a 4-year period until it was actually passed. But that built on the watershed. The Watershed Master Plan said we need to do more for the Eastern Creeks, and they identified a need back in 2001, and that was kicked off earlier from the 1986 decision to not extend those buffers up as far. So you can really tease this stuff out by looking back in time. Honestly, this would be for me, a 15 episode series on these. How many people would watch that? Undetermined. but there's a lot there, and there's a lot, and understanding like the difference, how this has evolved over time is really important in understanding what is possible and what is necessary for the future.